Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for the delay, but I was in a OECD meeting, and I'm so sorry for this 7 minutes delayed. And the meeting now is out, and we can be in our lecture. A very interesting, very important lecture for all of us, because 2 weeks ago we had this State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen. It was a very important moment for her because it was the moment in which she gave the world and Europe her ideas on the future. And also it was the first big discourse after the Recovery Fund, after the Next Generation EU. I think it was a very important discourse. Many expectations, and the discourse was a high-level discourse with some news, important news, for instance, on sustainability, on health, on migrations that were, I think, the most important big news, some of them a little bit unexpected, some missing part in the speech, if I may say. For instance, we expected more on the conference on the future of Europe. It was just, it was really very marginal in the discourse and very strong in terms of geopolitical position of the European Union. So we decided to have this today's lecture with two distinguished speakers. I thank them very much because they are with us, and I will give them the floor immediately. Nicole Koenig, first of all. Nicole Koenig, she is working at the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin. She's deputy director. And she's following European Union on some of the aspects that were at the very core of Ursula von der Leyen speech. So Nicole will start. Then Carlos Moedas, Carlos from Portugal. Carlos Moedas was the commissioner with the portfolio, many portfolios, but the most important one was on research. Carlos is working with us, with Sciences Po, since some months, and we are very happy because of the cooperation with him. And Carlos will, I think, give us some ideas, of course, à tout azimut on many issues, but it will be really very interesting to understand, Carlos, your point of views on the topics that were at the very center of your work since 2014. Because one of the flagships of Ursula von der Leyen Commission and of Ursula von der Leyen speech was, of course, on innovation, on technology. So it will be very interesting to listen your point. So without further ado, I stop here. I give the floor. Nicole, I would like just to tell all our audience that you can, of course, send us questions using the Q&A box in Zoom. I ask you to be very short in the questions, in writing the questions, so I can then turn questions to our two speakers and to have as many possible answers and many people attending the Q&A. So I stop here. I immediately give the floor to Nicole for her first part. Nicole, you have the floor, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Enrico, and thanks to Sciences Po and to PSIA also for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be discussing the State of the Union with also two true political experts, and to look a little bit back at the speech, but perhaps also ahead at issues that are coming. So what I wanted to do is to perhaps first take a quick step back and think about what the State of the Union speech is generally for. What are the kind of more general objectives that it's a tradition that we have seen also in the past commissions, but I think it has different objectives. So the first one is, of course, okay, it's about the State of the Union. It's about taking stock, where do we stand, and about, in this case, looking back at the first year. And then also looking ahead and presenting priorities for the next 12 months. And I think it has also been in the past an opportunity to shape the narrative and to insert some fresh and sometimes also bold ideas into the debate. If you remember, for example, Juncker speaking about a European army, which was very controversial. We can maybe discuss that later, what we think about that, but it's an opportunity to also launch controversial ideas. And I think this year it was special, of course, because of the context, not only because it was von der Leyen's first speech, but also, of course, because it comes after a global pandemic, or in the midst of a global pandemic, we probably have to say, and also after an important economic downturn. And I think here one of the objectives was also to reassure EU citizens and businesses that there is a brighter future ahead, and that I think explains a bit the optimistic tone. So what I wanted to do is to briefly go through the different parts of the speech and to see how the speech itself matches these different objectives. So I think, as I said, the first part was about reassuring citizens, and I think this was also the whole first part of the speech. Was the first priority was what she put under the title "Pulling Through Together." And I think in the whole first part, there was a strong focus on economic and health consequences of the pandemic. And of course, the central axis of this speech, in a way, was the historic agreement on a 1.8 trillion MFF, so budgetary and recovery deal package that the heads of state and government agreed in July over many sleepless nights. And I think it was important to make that a big point, because it was an important sign of solidarity, which, quite honestly, in the beginning of the pandemic, we have not necessarily seen. But now we had this agreement, first the Franco-German agreement, preparing also the Commission proposal building on that. And then we have this big agreement, which also means that it's the first time in the EU's history that the EU issues joint debt on such a large scale. So that was a very important sign of solidarity, and this is therefore also a clear priority of the speech. What often when you look at the press about the State of the Union speeches, the journalists like to cite how many times a particular term has been quoted, and I think in the case of the Next Generation EU, which is the recovery instrument, it has been mentioned a whole 17 times. So that just shows you how important it was, and I think the focus here was also very important, that the next steps is about spending it right. So that was reappearing in the whole speech. Then also still in this first part was her proposals in the direction of a European Health Union, which included strengthening different agencies and institutions, but also she said that there should be a discussion on stronger EU competences in the field of health, because we have seen in the past months that the EU's competences are very limited in this field, and that they should grow. But of course, this is something that this is actually the only moment that she referred to the conference on the future of Europe that Enrico just mentioned, because we have to understand that stronger competences in the field of health for the EU would be desirable, but would also require treaty change. So this is a bit unclear to what extent she will be able to deliver on that one. Then came the second part. The second part was really more about future topics for the EU, and the clear focus here was on what she calls the twin and digital transitions, and also making recovery fit with this green and digital transition. And I think these were priorities from the beginning of the Commission, and this is also an area where we have seen quite a lot of initiatives in the past months, and also some of the newer initiatives were rather in these fields. And I think one of the points that has been discussed quite a lot, also even ahead of the speech, was that she raised the EU's, or that she proposed raising the EU's emissions target until 2030 from 40%, emissions reduction target from 40% to 55%, which again matches her goal that Europe should become the EU should become a climate neutral continent until 2050. But again, here the question is, as in the field of health, a bit about the implementation. So first, the EU will have to pass a lot of legislation matching that aim, and then it's also about compliance of the member states, which, as we know from the past, has not always been perfect in climate issues. Then coming to the third part, Enrico briefly touched upon it as well, the EU's geopolitical role or the EU's global role. And here I would say that actually what we saw in the speech was quite a lower level of ambition than what we have seen in the beginning of this commission, but also, for example, under the Juncker Commission. What is interesting and striking, I think, that she made a clear point in the beginning of her term last year that she wanted to shape a geopolitical commission, meaning an EU able to bring together internal and external instruments in order to be able to influence these geopolitical competition moments that we see, particularly, of course, with the competition between the US and China. But the term geopolitical commission simply didn't appear in her speech. She then mentioned one of the things that we have also heard from Jean-Claude Juncker before, which was that we need to move from unanimity and EU foreign policy decision-making to qualified majority voting, to avoid these situations that one member state can simply block sanctions against the regime in Belarus, for example. But there she already lowered the level of ambition and said that this should apply only to two areas, which is on the one hand, the implementation of sanctions, so not whole sanctions regimes as Juncker had proposed, but the implementation of sanctions and human rights declarations. And you could see this lowering of ambition, which also reflects the fact that we have seen in the past months that the member states that you need a unanimity to move towards qualified majority voting in this field, and that we simply don't have the critical mass to move there. And then one of the missing parts that Enrico, you referred to, was also that she didn't mention at all European Defence Cooperation, which is striking in a way, because this is the first time also in the EU's history that we have one part of the EU's budget that should foster European defense cooperation, the industrial research and development. And it's striking to me that she hasn't mentioned defense cooperation at all. And then we come to the fourth part, which is probably the most critical part, and she had used the title that I find a bit euphemistic, that we need new vitality for Europe, and then focused on some of the most divisive topics for the European Union, and that's of course migration on the one hand and rule of law issues on the other. So she was quite brief on the question of rule of law. Here, the key issue that is being discussed intensely still at the moment is the question of rule of law conditionality in the EU budget. Here we have seen today agreement in the Council, but the Council has already watered down the position of the European Commission on this rule of law conditionality. And we'll see how it happens in the negotiations to come with the European Parliament. And one of the problems here, of course, is she spoke quite a lot about European values, including, for example, LGBT rights and so on. But this rule of law mechanism is only about the rule of law, and it's not about the EU's other fundamental values. So we still have this question how to deal with member states that do not respect the EU's fundamental values. Do we have any sanctions for that? And then the final part was on migration. She announced what we have seen last week, the new Pact for migration and asylum. And this can be seen, some people have said that this is a little bit the last chance proposal of the Commission to forge a compromise after 5 years of very difficult negotiations between the member states on the reform of the European asylum system. But I think one of the key issue here and the key controversial points has, of course, been this question of solidarity and relocation of migrants, and the question whether we can have a binding solidarity mechanism. And what we have seen now in this proposal of the Commission is that we have on the one hand a binding solidarity mechanism, but a very flexible interpretation of solidarity. And even with this binding and flexible solidarity, I think we have a problem that was one of the blocking problems, or one of the problems in negotiations all along, is that there are relatively few incentives for those that are skeptical. So for example, the Visegrad countries, to change the status quo. So why should they agree to a binding relocation mechanism? And I think we're facing a risk looking ahead that the negotiations continue to drag on, and that we see situations such as the one in Moria, that happened in Moria again, and that we will see maybe even camps like Moria with an EU flag on them. So this is a risk that I see coming from this migration pact, but I'm sure we can discuss that further. But just to sum up from my side, I think it was definitely an important speech. It was also a feel-good speech. It was very strong on reassuring citizens and businesses. I think there were few very surprising and bold initiatives in the speech. And I think it was relatively weak in terms of geopolitics. And I think we're still also looking ahead at these divisive issues such as
thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you. And I give the floor now to Carlos for his comments.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, first of all, to my dear friend Enrico, Prime Minister Letta, and to Nicole, also here in the panel, and she did really a very good job of going through the different parts of the speech. So let me tell you, or try to add value to what Nicole just said. First of all, what is the State of the Union speech, and when was it created? There was no State of the Union speech before 2010. The creation was from President Barroso, the former president before Juncker, that decided to create this institutional event where you would go to the parliament like the American president. And as you know, in the United States is a big moment, the State of the Union. And so Barroso was an institutional person. He really believed that the most important thing was basically institutions. And so Barroso was historically somehow the man, in this case, that built the little nuts and bolts of the institution of the Commission, and created this feeling that the president of the Commission is somehow a president of Europe. Unfortunately, the Lisbon Treaty got him another president, which was the president of the Council, which at the time, I think that nobody was expecting, and created this confusion of having a president of the Council and the president of the European Commission. But Barroso was the institutional man, and I think that we somehow owe to Barroso this idea of making the point of the president of the Commission as the CEO. And so the CEO goes to the parliament and gives the State of the Union. And so when I went to the Commission in 2014, this was already a tradition. And so I remember the work and I don't think that you even imagine how difficult it is to write a speech like this one. So you have at the time 28 members, and so the president plus 27. 2 months before, we had to send to the president all our contributions to the speech. What do we think was important? And of course, everybody thinks that what they do is the most important thing. And the president cannot touch everything. So they have to really spend time thinking, what is my message? What do I want to get across to Europeans? And so this is I'm just setting the scene So you see the difficulty and the nervousness. I remember that was one of these days that you could feel that the president was anxious to get to there and to speak. So it was a really important day, and I imagine that also around Ursula von der Leyen. So let's now go to what happened, and let's go to the speech here. I think was a speech that was really very good. And there's 3 reasons for that. What are the ingredients of a good speech? I think the ingredients of a good political speech are threefold: energy, storytelling, and concrete announcements. And Ursula von der Leyen was able to have the 3. So the energy that she naturally has, I think that she sometimes even overacts. You know, she's very prepared. She tells the stories and she kind of overacts. Like she really, sometimes you feel that she was too much prepared. That was no room for improvisation, but still very, very good and with a very good energy. And then there's the storytelling. I mean, she really gets very personal in the speeches. And when, I don't know if you remember at the end of the speech, she talks about Carola and Vittoria that were playing tennis on the rooftops of Italy. And she talks about solidarity, but she feels like you can see these 2 girls playing tennis in the rooftop, and you imagine that what you saw in YouTube, and she goes very personal. And then the most difficult part of a speech like this is basically to be concrete. And that is extremely difficult at the European level. I mean, even I imagine that Enrico, as Prime Minister, knows that at the national level is also difficult sometimes. But at the European level, imagine, I mean, you don't really have the power that people think you have. You don't have the power to decide sometimes on very concrete things, but you have to have it to be concrete and to announce things that people feel will change their lives. And I think that here she really nailed it. She was very, very good. I mean, she, first of all, she did a wonderful job on announcing the reduction of emissions. And she goes and she says, look, I'm gonna, to 2030, we will reduce emissions compared to 1990 on 55%. And when she says that, she knows that the left wing is very happy, but the right wing or part of the right wing would not probably be very happy. So on the line after that, she says, but yesterday I met and I received a letter from, I don't know, 500 companies that said, yes, you should that. That's fantastic. So, you know, I mean, she goes left and then she goes to the right and she announces something very concrete and very unique, which is the reduction of the emissions. It was like the big announcement that she wonderfully was able also to leak the day before to the papers. And so it worked very well. Then she goes into what I think is also one of the big projects that she wants to launch on health. And here she does a couple of things that I think are extremely important. And I agree with Nicole when she said that she talked less about geopolitical, as the word geopolitical, that she's talked a lot in the past. But to create this health union is also very geopolitical. So she was basically telling people, look, I'm not talking about geopolitics, but launching a health union, being and announcing that I will be in the G20 and I'll be launching the all biomedical innovation center, like I call it BARDA. And the ones, I don't know if some of you are from the United States, but why does she call it BARDA? Because the United States has an institution of innovation called DARPA. And so even on that, she was very smart on choosing the name and getting that to the hearts of people saying, no, I mean, this is very concrete. She will create an organization that will do biomedical innovation. And then she goes on saying that, yes, by the way, we are changing multilateralism. We were the ones that raised 16 billion for vaccines. we were the ones that were able to put the world together. It was not China, it was not the US, it was us. We were able to shout and get 16 billion euros for vaccines, to create and to distribute the vaccine. So somehow she was putting the tone and saying, we are leaders. Europe is leading, and Europe will lead on this new wave of multilateralism. And by the way, we will lead on the transformation of the WTO and the WHO, and we will be the ones leading that. And I thought that was very, 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 very strong. So what were the points that I felt were weaker? I think that apart from what Nicole already said in terms of the defense cooperation, I think that she didn't talk about science. She really didn't make an effort to talk about the importance of science. And here, and that's why I, with the invitation of Enrico Letta, I wrote with Pascal Lamy an article for the papers that went out yesterday, where we said that, look, she didn't talk about science, and she's not putting money on science as she should. You know, I mean, the only way out of this crisis is science. I mean, if you want to get out of this crisis, you need a vaccine, that is science. You need to distribute the vaccine, that is science. You need more knowledge on treating infections in the future, and that's science. And she didn't put the money on that. You know, you have the 750 billion, you have the 1.1 trillion, let's say, and so the whole together is 1.8, as Nicole said. But then the program of science was reduced from our proposal in Juncker, at the Juncker Commission, of 100 billion to 90 billion. So the point that was the point that Europe could get of putting science at the center, yes, biomedical science, very important, but she didn't really put science at the heart. And today you cannot just say that it's biomedical. It's about interdisciplinarity, it's about diversity, it's about fundamental science. And that I was frankly a little bit disappointed, but that is what it is. I mean, there's nothing we can do. I imagine that she had to structure the speech. So I'm not even criticizing. I'm just here as a kind of, today as a political pundit. I'm doing a comment on something that is very tough to do. And it was very good, but there was a couple of missing points. So I think that to start the conversation, I would give probably now the floor. I just wanted to make another comment on Nicole said about the qualifying majority voting. And this is a very funny point, because every president of the commission talks about qualified majority. Everybody knows that unanimity doesn't work. I mean, if you put 27 people at the table, do you think that you get to a good solution if everybody has to agree unanimously? No. And so you need to have parts of the very important things that you have in Europe, like human rights and sanctions, with basically a qualified majority. But you know what? I mean, all the presidents of the commission have put these on the speech, and nothing happened, because the prime ministers in general and the governments, they will never allow that. So it kind of is, I mean, and she was smart, as Nicole was saying, she tried to nail that to 2 issues. But even that, I really doubt that we will be able to do it. And so that is one of the reasons that we have so many problems to communicate with people, because people really think that we have more power than we have. And at the European Commission, a lot of the things that people sometimes come to us saying, but why does Europe is not doing it? Because we need unanimity. You need everybody to agree, and you'll never get it. And you cannot even come to a camera on one of these things and say, as president of the commission, I'm mad at this prime minister. he's doing the wrong thing. You cannot even say that because he's one of your shareholders. So that was also a moment that is very typical in those State of the Unions. So now I will, I think, go back to Enrico, to our Professor Letta.
We don't hear you.
I think it was fantastic to hear your points, your insight, Carlos, on how a speech like that is organized. There are many questions. I have many comments too, but I don't want to waste time. So I take immediately the questions from our students, because as usual, our students are protagonists and they are the very heart of our discussion. So I don't want to take time for. A question by Lise Brumont on migrations, and the question is about if whether the proposal and what Ursula von der Leyen said introduce a stricter approach on preventing illegal ways of immigration, and what will be the impact on hotspots such as the Moria camp. So I ask you maybe to answer this topic on migration. There's I saw another question on migration that was, but I think maybe you can say a few words both on how you saw this part of the speech, and maybe because we had also the proposal last Wednesday presented by von der Leyen and Skinas. Maybe if Nicole and Carlos, you have to say a few words on migration, because if I see the newspapers the day after, or televisions and web, it was full. The title of the speech was on migration, how to overcome Dublin and so on. That was the frame of the speech. So what do you think about it, Nicole?
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, in the speech, it was actually not so prominent, but of course, it was a frame because a few days before we had these fires in the camp in Moria, and what she said then, you know, this really shows that this painful situation shows that we now have to come together. I think what we then saw in the Pact was, as I said before, I think there was really an attempt to find a compromise. So the member states have been negotiating that for 5 years now, and I think what she tried, or what the Commission tried to do in this approach, to have this balance between, on the one hand, limiting irregular migration, and on the other hand, providing solidarity and living up to the Geneva Convention. That's always this balance. But for me, I have the impression that the balance is a little bit more towards a more restrictive approach, especially if you consider the fact that solidarity, so the idea or proposals by the Commission and the European Parliament initially meant that solidarity means a binding relocation mechanism where all member states participate and share the burden, if you like, of incoming migrants arriving in the frontline states. So that was the idea in the beginning. And what we see now is a notion of solidarity where you have different possibilities to provide solidarity. So you can, on a voluntary basis, pledge to relocate asylum seekers, but you can also provide financial support measures. And what is rather new is that this relabeling of solidarity towards return. So one of the key challenges of the Dublin system, or of the asylum system, is the difficulty to return asylum seekers with a negative asylum decision. So now they have introduced this as part of the solidarity mechanism, which is showing how the Commission tries to bring these two camps together. Yes, we have a binding solidarity mechanism, but you can also include return in that. And my fear is a little bit that now we have a situation where the Visegrad countries say, well, you know, we still, why do we have, what's in it for us? Why should we agree on any form of binding solidarity if we know that most of the migrants in any case want to go to the northern countries, right? So this has always been the blocking element, and we have seen that in immediate reactions. So what could happen in the course of the negotiations is that we end up with mostly the restrictive measures, which also part of these restrictive measures is shortening asylum procedures on the borders, especially for migrants with low recognition rates. And then returning them immediately. And so in that sense, I think there is a risk of coming towards a more restrictive approach, which does not mean that the solidarity dilemma will be solved, because in the end, we will still probably then see coalitions of the willing taking the migrants from the search and rescue missions. And yeah, this is a little bit the danger that I see.
Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is such a good example where unanimity and being all together around the table doesn't work, because you will never find a consensus around the table of all the member states for this one. And so here we really have the problem that the Commission is there to take all the blame, but the Commission has really no power. And so what you see is that from Juncker to Ursula von der Leyen is that you try to kind of wishy-wash a little bit less and try to get a consensus. And as Nicole was saying, a sense of a solidarity that is not binding, but it's solidarity. And to be frank, I mean, I read the speech and I didn't get it. And so I think that this is one of the points that Europe should be ashamed of as a whole, of not being able to get together and say, look, this is impossible. We have to have a binding solidarity. We have to divide these by the countries. How can we as a person or an entity think that you will leave Italy and Greece just alone on these, and you say, no, not in my country. I don't want it in my country. Or to have a system, which is what you have today, that there's a totally arbitrage for the refugees. Even when they are in a country, they want to go to another country because they know the conditions in that other country, which is Germany most of the times, are much more favorable to them. So even if you had, and even when you do that solidarity of putting the refugees in different countries, what happens, and I saw that in my country, in Portugal, they stay here for, I don't know, a couple of weeks, and then they go to Germany because they have family there or they have someone that they know there. And so you have a system that doesn't work, but the Commission alone will not be able to solve it until we have the courage to say that these cannot be decided on unanimity. You have to decide these with a qualified majority, and at the same time, really in a way that everyone respects that decision, because you can have a system where you have qualified majority and you have countries like Hungary that decide not to respect that qualified majority. And that's the game that we actually played during the Juncker Commission. So to be frank, I think this is really one of the parts of the job of Margaritis, which I know very well, that will be very difficult to be successful, and no one has a solution because that solidarity de facto sometimes does not exist. I mean, and a lot of countries don't see it in that way. So I'm hopeful, but I'm pessimistic about this.
Thank you, Carlos. Two questions on Hungary and Poland. Noah Flechel and Naomi Colfort. Two questions on the rule of law conditionality. What do you expect on these topics? The discussion is being very, very intense in these very days. The two questions are on similar aspects? Do you think that Hungary and Poland could potentially block it by saying they withdraw from the agreement? There's a sort of blackmail that is taking place. What do you think about this point? And maybe I add also another question about Nathalie Dublé. Do you see a realistic chance that the EU will soon turn away from unanimity? You touched the point, but maybe you can add something, Nicole.
Yeah, I'll start with the unanimity question, also to link a bit to what Carlos said. So it's true that especially also the Juncker Commission has pushed for unanimity, not only in foreign policy, but also in taxation and energy, in different issue areas. And it was one of the tasks now assigned to, for example, EU High Representative Borrell to keep pushing for the extension of unanimity as it is already allowed for in the treaties. And I'll just take the area that I know best, which is foreign policy. So we did an expert survey with decision makers in the end of last year to actually understand who are the drivers among the member states behind extending qualified majority voting in the field of foreign policy, and which ones are opposed. And was actually a striking picture where only around 6 member states were really in favor. So Germany, the Benelux, and Finland, and I'm probably missing one, maybe Italy also after government change. But that there was a big group of member states that was in a sort of gray zone, so especially smaller member states and also neutral member states, which were afraid to lose their voice and their veto power. And then there were those member states that were just opposed for sovereignty reasons. So that was a lot of Eastern and Southern European member states. And so I think this is what you described, Carlos. So we have this situation where the Commission is pushing to make full use of the potential of the treaties, which allow for that. But as you need, and this is the irony, unanimity in order to move to qualified majority voting, you are stuck. And I agree that, you know, that maybe it's a smart move to therefore then tone down the level of ambition. But you could also argue differently and say that the Commission is the guardian of the treaties. The Commission should simply keep pushing for that. So that on qualified majority voting, on the rule of law. Now the Council has, so yesterday there was a German proposal for the Council to agree on this rule of law conditionality, and you could already see that it's, as I said, softer than the Commission approach, in the sense that, for example, the Commission approach said that this rule of law mechanism should be activated if there are irregularities in terms of rule of law, whether this, whereas this proposal says if there is a breach of rule of law, and also the decision-making procedure is different. So before it was a negative qualified majority, so the Commission proposes to sanction a country, and now it was changed into qualified majority, which means that you need a qualified majority among the member states saying, yes, we want to sanction, let's say, Hungary. So it has already been softened, and there's also a break clause in this proposal saying that if there are some doubts of being treated unfairly, the issue can be referred to the European Council. So this is at the moment the compromise that we are seeing, that the Council agreed on by qualified majority. But now it will start with the discussions will start with the European Parliament, and of course it's all related to the bigger package of the recovery fund and the multi-annual financial framework, so the EU budget. So my take is that, or this is really a guess, that it probably will go through, also because in the end the member states that are opposing this mechanism also are in favor of bringing through the recovery instrument. But maybe that's optimistic.
Thank you, Carlos.
No, very, very good comments from Nicole. I was just thinking that this is really essential that Europe gets the act together about the rule of law, and that everyone understands that is as important to respect the deficit and to respect the debt levels so we can live together in the same house. It's as important as that to respect the rule of law and the values, the European values. But of course, the devil here is on the detail. It's very easy to put the point forward. And I remember the discussions on our commission about what does it mean? What does it mean really to respect the rule of law? And of course, there's moments where things are clear cut, but in other moments, they're not as clear cut as that. And when you're talking about Hungary and Poland, I think that the two countries were very smart as always counter-arguing the positions of the Commission, and it was really difficult, the fight, because they will always find an example in another European country of really ways that they could compare to the ways that they were doing it. For instance, at some point, let me give you an example. In Hungary, they decided that they will put all the funds for science in just one institution. And that institution was an institution, a new institution, a science foundation. But of course, the problem for us is that we saw that somehow that new body would have or would be done by people that were more political appointees. But the counter argument of the Hungarians was, look, I mean, this is what happens in a lot of countries. You put the money in a foundation and that money, so we're not taking anything from or doing anything different. But so sometimes it's not even the way that you're building the structure, but it's about the people that you put in that structure and the way you build it. I just wanted to give you a very small example of things that sometimes look very obvious, because we had a lot of scientists from Hungary writing to us saying, look, this is unbelievable. They are taking the money out of the universities, they're taking the money out of the associations, they're putting it with a body that is basically a political body. And then we went there and we saw, look, but this is like the Science Foundation in the UK or the Science Foundation in France. And so it's sometimes difficult. In other points, I think it's very easy, and Europe then is not able to act. So I'm very sorry, because I think this is one of the points that it's really difficult. And you saw today, I think Mr. Orban asked for Commissioner Vera Jourova to resign because he felt that she was basically going over the limits of what he, as a shareholder of the European Union, can allow. And so it's a very difficult point, but it's one that I think we have to fight together, and that not only the Commission, but the allies of a world where values and the rule of law are the base of our societies, we cannot let it down. Of course, what she does, I mean, in the speech, she says, we're going to do an annual review. Yes, but an annual review is not going to change anything. I mean, what is an annual review of the rule of law? I think that is one of the parts of the speech where she says, we're going to do an annual review of the rule of law. You know, and that's one of the ways that sometimes in politics you have to do something to kind of give you a little bit of time, because I mean, you know where the problems are and you know what the problems can be. So on the rule of law, I think this is something that is, to be frank, to your generation that believe in Europe, to you to change these. I don't think that in the foreseeable future, we will be able to change it in an effective way, even with a qualified majority. I think this will be extremely, extremely difficult to put into place in a way that it works. But it should, but life sometimes is unfair.
Thank you, Carlos. I have to say that on unanimity and qualified majority, there were also questions, but I think you already answered from Sasha Sterenberger and from Julia Hammermeister. I would like to take one question. There are two questions on defense, one from Charlie Millington, and I would like to ask you what you think about this lack of attention in the speech on defense, and what you expect. Do you feel that will be greater convergence or divergence in regional policy on some of these aspects, and why so this low attention in the speech? And was also another point on that. Yes, it was a point on trying also to link what is happening with also what happened with Cyprus and Turkey and the different problems that we had. And of course, there's a relation to this, Stefan Maukner. And on foreign policy, I add also one question, Jinyu Chen, on Belarus. And the question is, what can the European Union do? I ask you to write more shorter questions, because your questions are a little bit long. But this question is interesting also because that allows me to announce that next Wednesday, our lecture, our weekly lecture, will be on Belarus at 5 o'clock as usual. And maybe I add another point, if you agree, Nicole and Carlos. Another point is Victor Pellicero Calvo. His question is why the speech was not considered in the different capitals, in the different domestic media environment as the biggest speech in the year, the first news. And so I add also a question, what was the reaction both in Lisbon and in Berlin? Carlos, you're based in Lisbon. Nicole, you're based in Berlin. What was the reaction in the domestic media there? So stop here, Nicole.
Wow, that's a very broad range of issues. Why was it not mentioned? Why was defense not mentioned in the speech? I was asking myself that question as well. I think one of the reasons could be that, and that's something also that Carlos addressed previously. So when you spoke about the EU's 7-year budget and about how science became smaller through the negotiations, that has been exactly the same for defense. So although it's the first time that defense cooperation measures are part of the EU's multi-annual financial framework, they have been cut in some cases by half. So there's this European Defense Fund, which actually von der Leyen, when she was German defense minister, was one of the key advocates. And she also mentioned in her political guidelines last year that this should be a key priority, that she wants to have a strong European Defense Fund. But in the negotiations, in the course of the negotiations, it has been cut by 40%. The same for military mobility. There has been some funding foreseen to enhance military mobility across Europe, to say that if in the case that you need to move tanks, for example, from Germany to the eastern borders, that this is actually possible in terms of infrastructure. And the Commission was supposed to provide over 5 billion for this military mobility, and now it's only 1.5. So it has been cut down quite a lot. And that for me perhaps explains also why this geopolitical ambition has not been so big in the speech, because also Carlos mentioned the role of the Commission, role of the EU in pushing for a vaccine internationally, and also on multilateralism and reforms and so on. But for example, what we also see in these budget negotiations is that although we can expect rising challenges in terms of in developing countries, we have actually now numbers that are below the current numbers, the current multi-annual financial framework for development cooperation. So what I want to say is that we have had some important cuts in these domains and also in defense. This is perhaps one reason. The other reason why maybe it was particularly defense was more absent from the speech is that, of course, this is an intergovernmental area. So if something happens in this domain, we can need the member states completely on board. And the member states are launching initiatives in this field. We now see a so-called strategic compass process, where the idea is to jointly agree on common threats and how the EU should react to them and strengthen its instruments, but it's a member state driven process. So maybe these two aspects explain it a little bit. To go to the other topics, maybe briefly on Belarus, what can the EU do? Belarus and Cyprus, so that very much links also to this question of unanimity, qualified majority voting. So what we have seen is that we had a decision to have targeted sanctions against those responsible for election fraud and violence in Belarus. For which you need unanimity. And at the same time, we have the situation with the Turkish drilling activities in Cyprus, where again where Cyprus has blocked the sanctions against Belarus, because we have not seen yet similar sanctions regarding those responsible for the drilling activities in Cyprus. So we have a kind of issue linkage here, and so one of the answers again would be probably we will see sanctions on both accounts. But then, of course, what can and should the EU do also in both cases is to try to work towards a negotiated solution. So in Belarus, we have now seen a little bit of opening from Lukashenko, who said that we should have a change of the constitution and possibly then earlier fresh elections. And there, the EU should be engaged in the negotiations to make sure that there are real changes and that these are not only cosmetic changes. And for Turkey and Cyprus, it's of course also important to weigh in, also together with the Americans. We have seen that now with Pompeo visiting, to work towards a political solution in both cases. And just on the final point, why was the speech not considered the biggest speech that we can have? That's a good question. I guess that really comes back to the fundamental problem that we don't really have a common European public space. So we don't have European TV channels that perhaps show in every member state the speech in all the languages. And even if it was the case, then maybe not everybody would follow it. So we have the same with the European Parliament elections every time around. And that for me also explains, so I have seen relatively little coverage here in Germany on von der Leyen's speech, I must say. So grabbing the headlines, climate change, Green Deal issues, yes, but not very profound analysis.
Thank you. I have to add also that for my Italian experience, the reaction was 90% on the frame, we will abolish Dublin Treaty. That was 90% of the coverage of the speech. And so I think it is almost the same. Carlos.
Very good. No, I was thinking about the defense part, which I think that probably Ursula von der Leyen was the person that I've listened in the past with a fantastic and articulate speech about the need for European defense. And that was back in 2018 when she came to Brussels, and she was basically giving a speech about the importance of European defense. And, you know, I think that when Juncker came to his speech of the State of the Union on that year, and he said about the European army, and everybody went against, and there was like a terrible reaction, and he had to backtrack. But I think that, you know, at some point in 40 years, in 50 years, whatever, you will need a European military. You will need to protect ourselves together with a military that is common. And you can do that in very different ways. And you can do it, as Ursula described at the time, by first looking at the procurement, trying to do things together. But then you need to have a brand, a European brand. I'll never forget when I visited in 2014, I went to the Baltics, and I remember to see on the street in Lithuania, in Latvia, American troops, the American army, and I, but like, how is it possible? You know, we are in the European Union. You come to a member state and you see the American army. It doesn't make any sense. And the same that we saw in the forest fires. I mean, you would see basically no European force of a kind of a protective force to fight the fires, and people were saying, where are you? Where is Europe? Why is nobody here? So I think that in the future, in a long time, because it's not going to be in a short time, you will have it. And Ursula von der Leyen, that speech that I remember very well, she started by saying that the idea of an army was basically from the 1950s. In 1953, but basically the French at the time, they had the biggest army. They still have somehow today. They didn't want that to happen. But so the discussion, these discussions take a long, long time. And at some point, I think that it will make sense to have a brand, and a European brand. And that goes to the second question, which is the speech, which is basically that because we don't have this identity, these European Union symbols, then it's very difficult to communicate the State of the Union. You know, and most of the people and the young people, they eventually know about the State of the Union speech in the US, but they don't know about the State of the Union speech in Europe. And so I think that we need more symbols, and they can be like the idea of a European university, they can be around defense, but they have to be simple and easy for people to understand. I spent 5 years, and I remember Federica Mogherini trying to explain me again and again how the whole defense system was organized. And it was extremely difficult because you had intergovernmental with PESCO, you had the European Defense Fund, then you have, of course, NATO. And, you know, you, even if you are a politician, you're interested in the subject, it's very difficult to get it right. And so how do you ask people to understand? People don't understand. And I think that at some point we will have to revisit that European army idea. And I feel that will have to be revisited. That was my first point, because Nicole has said all the rest that I agree. And so on your point, Enrico, on the reaction in Portugal, I mean, there was not a lot of reaction. There was a couple of news of that the speech happened in the night news, but nothing more. There's no discussion really about it. Some discussion from the environmental groups that were very happy with the speech, but not more. And then on Belarus, I think that on that matter, I think Ursula was quite aggressive. I think that the speech for the first time, much more than in the past, was quite aggressive towards this point of Belarus, in the right tone. The way that she talks to Russia, to China, she had a little higher tone of aggressiveness. And I think that's very important to get to any result. And so then you have the technicalities, but I think that you really had a strong speech and aggressive speech from Ursula when she refers to Belarus, when she talks about the fact that we cannot put up anymore with it, with Russia, and she goes on and on. So I thought that was interesting.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I think you answered some of the questions we had. For instance, a question on migration and labor policies, Frances Fagan. A question, Igor Marianin, on foreign policy and defense policy. We had also a question from Sylvester Francis Alonso. Those were also on the role of the State of the Union speech, and that was already answered. There's a final question, Lucas Vatle, is about about the wider democratization of institutions, how the citizens feel the connection between them and Brussels, and wouldn't giving a European citizen a bigger say in the actions of EU further legitimize EU-wide decisions. And on this question, I would like just to answer in the last 30 seconds of our webinar that the conference on the future of Europe will be exactly there to try to answer this question and to find some new ideas. I think we will try to organize soon, when the format of this conference will be more clear, we will organize another webinar. For the moment, I would like to give a great virtual applause to Carlos and Nicole, because they were great, and thank you for because you were very good in joining personal experiences, Carlos, how this State of the Union speech is usually the way in which the entire politician level and official level of the Commission is a sort of moment of truth about ranking of power of the different general directions of the Commission. So that was very interesting. And thank you very much also for your insights on the different points. Thank you, Nicole, for your presentation. Thank you so much. And I stop here our webinar. See you soon.